It was a chilly November evening when Daniel arrived at the airport, dragging his worn suitcase behind him. The hum of conversation and rolling suitcases filled the air, just as expected. The overhead lights glowed bright and steady, and the polished floors reflected every movement. After a long week away on business, he was more than ready to return home, to sit by his fireplace, and forget about work for a while. His flight, scheduled for 8 p.m., promised a short, smooth journey, back to the familiar streets of his hometown. Checking the departure boards, Daniel frowned. Next to his flight number, in bold red letters, the word delayed blinked steadily. There was no explanation, no estimated departure time, only that cold, frustrating word. Glancing outside through the tall glass windows, he expected to see dark clouds or pouring rain, maybe even a brewing storm. But the night sky was perfectly clear. The stars sparkled like tiny diamonds scattered across an endless black sheet, and the runway lights blinked in their neat, steady rhythm. Shrugging it off, he moved toward his gate and found an empty seat, near a charging station. Plugging his phone into the socket, he leaned back, scrolling mindlessly through news articles and social media, trying to pass the time. Minutes melted into hours, and the airport around him began to change. At first, it was subtle. The background chatter grew quieter, the number of announcements over the loudspeakers thinned out, and the bustle of travelers slowed. Daniel didn't notice at first. His mind was lost in the glow of his phone screen, lost in funny videos and sports updates. But slowly, a strange feeling crept in. An uneasy chill that crawled up his spine and made the tiny hairs on his arms stand on end. When he finally looked up, the scene before him was not what he expected. The crowd had thinned drastically. Where there had once been dozens, families dragging their kids along, businessmen tapping on laptops, young couples laughing together, now there were barely 10 or 12 people scattered across the rows of seats. And even stranger than their small number was their behavior. A man in a wrinkled gray suit sat stiffly, his head tilted back at an odd angle as he stared blankly at the ceiling. A woman in a bright yellow jacket sat a few rows away, rocking slightly and whispering something under her breath, too soft to hear. Others simply sat, motionless with wide, vacant eyes that didn't seem to see anything at all. Daniel's throat grew dry. His heart picked up a faster beat. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but he couldn't explain it. Maybe a technical problem with the airport? Maybe some kind of emergency drill? But if that were the case, why no announcements? Why no staff walking around giving instructions? Standing up slowly, Daniel scanned the area for anyone wearing an airport uniform. The counters at the boarding gates stood abandoned, their screens flickering between flight information and blank static. No one called out flight numbers, no one hurried along carrying radios or paperwork. It was like the airport had emptied itself out, leaving behind only a handful of broken people and one very confused man. An uneasy curiosity gnawed at him. He took a few careful steps toward the massive windows overlooking the runway. Out there, planes stood like sleeping giants under the cold night sky, but not a single one moved. No luggage carts zipped by, no flashing lights marked activity. Even the workers in neon vests, usually busy buzzing around the planes, were gone. Trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, Daniel turned back toward the main departure board. He hoped for an update, a change, anything to explain the strange emptiness. But when his eyes found the screens again, something new sent a jolt of cold terror through his chest. The digital monitors flickered, not smoothly, but with sharp, crackling jumps of static. Flight numbers and times blinked in and out, replaced by strange, almost nonsensical messages. At first, he thought he had misread them. Maybe tiredness was playing tricks on him. But no matter how many times he blinked, the words stayed. One screen, directly above Gate 14, now pulsed with the warning, "Don't fall asleep." Another, across the wide hall by gate 16, flashed an even stranger command. "Stay in the light." Daniel's fingers curled tightly around the handle of his suitcase. The world around him seemed to shift slightly, the floors tilting in a way that was more felt than seen. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, deep enough that it vibrated through his bones but too faint to hear properly. He told himself it had to be a technical malfunction. Glitches happen. Airports are huge, complicated places. He repeated the thought over and over, clinging to it like a lifeline. Yet, deep inside, a small voice, cold and certain, whispered that this was not just some normal glitch. Taking a shaky breath, Daniel decided to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. Maybe the information desk would still be staffed. Maybe security guards were still patrolling the halls. Surely he wasn't completely alone in this vast, echoing space. Dragging his suitcase behind him, he started walking toward the main terminal. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, in the huge empty space, each step sounding too loud, too sharp. And all around him, those few remaining passengers sat silently, unmoving, staring into the air or muttering to themselves like broken dolls. Daniel quickened his pace. Something unseen was creeping closer, something that made the very air feel heavy and wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to get out, to run. But the airport stretched ahead endlessly, quiet, waiting, and full of shadows that seemed just a little too deep, a little too dark. And somewhere behind him, unnoticed, at first something new began to whisper. Daniel's heart beat faster as he moved through the empty terminal. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound that filled the vast, otherwise silent space. The large, smooth floors reflected his hurried footsteps in an eerie way, as if they were amplifying his every movement. There had been no announcement, no explanation. The flight he was supposed to take was nowhere to be found. He continued his walk, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping down his spine. The quiet was unnerving, but he told himself it was nothing more than a delay, just a temporary glitch, a breakdown in normal airport operations. Surely the workers were just off doing something. He couldn't be the only one noticing how strange everything had become. But as he glanced around, it became more and more apparent that this wasn't normal. At first, Daniel had written off the empty hallways and the strange lack of activity as just an odd coincidence. Perhaps some passengers had already boarded or left for another gate. Maybe there was an announcement he missed. Yet, as he made his way through the terminal, a creeping sense of isolation settled into him. There was something more than a delay going on here. He passed by the information desk, expecting to find a staff member who could offer some answers. But the desk stood unmanned, just like the others. He looked down at the countertop, hoping for a sign, a piece of paper left behind with a reason for the strange quiet. But nothing. The desk was just as empty as everything else. Turning on his heel, Daniel began walking further into the terminal, hoping to spot someone, anyone. Security guards typically patrolled the gates, but the hallways stretched empty before him, not a soul in sight. He passed through an open area where the small cafes and kiosks were usually buzzing with life. The counters were empty. Chairs were still, as if no one had even bothered to sit down in hours. There were no bags piled up from travelers in a hurry to catch their flights, no baristas making coffee, no workers cleaning the floor. It wasn't just that the place was empty. It was the unnatural stillness of it all. The silence felt wrong. Something about it sent a chill up his spine. Even though he was in the middle of a large airport, it felt like he had been swallowed whole by an enormous, echoing void. As Daniel passed by another gate, the lights flickered. He looked up sharply, eyes scanning the overhead signs. They glowed a dim, sickly yellow for a second, and then flickered back to their normal bright white. He told himself it was probably nothing, just another malfunction in the system. Airports were known for their technical issues, right? But when he glanced over at the nearby monitor, his stomach sank. The digital display above Gate 14 had changed. Instead of showing the usual flight details, a new message now blinked at him. Don't fall asleep. His heart skipped a beat. The words burned into his mind, leaving him feeling disoriented. A chill ran through his veins, spreading from the back of his neck to his fingertips. It didn't make sense. Why would the board say that? Why would anyone need to be warned not to sleep in an airport at this hour? Daniel's eyes quickly shifted to the next screen, the one above Gate 16. The words, "Stay in the light," flashed brightly before dimming again. He stood frozen for a moment, a feeling of dread spreading through him like a slow poison. The bay messages didn't seem like normal airport announcements. They felt ominous, like they were meant to keep him awake, keep him alert. His mind raced, trying to piece it all together. What was going on here? Looking around him, the airport seemed even more desolate than before. The few people left seated in the waiting area were not moving, not talking, not even looking at their phones. They sat like lifeless statues, their faces expressionless and vacant. He noticed a man sitting just ahead of him. His clothes were ordinary, yet the man's posture was anything but normal. His head was tilted back unnaturally, his eyes wide open but focused on something far beyond what Daniel could see. He was so still, it was as though he wasn't really there. At the far end of the terminal, Daniel saw a woman in a bright yellow jacket, her hands tightly clasped together as if holding something precious. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, her lips moving silently, as though she was speaking to someone invisible. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried an unsettling tone. It sounded almost like a chant, repeating the same words, over and over again. Stay awake. Stay awake. Stay awake. The words sent another shiver down his spine. Daniel's breath came faster, his pulse pounding in his chest. Something was wrong. Everything in him screamed to leave, to get out, to escape the strange atmosphere. But he didn't know where to go. He felt trapped, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The terminal stretched on endlessly, its dull fluorescent lights flickering sporadically above. The whispers began then. At first, they were quiet, like the faint sound of the wind rustling through dry leaves. But then they grew louder, clearer. It was as though they were coming from behind him, just beyond his reach. Come back. Come back. You belong here. Stay with us. Daniel whipped around, heart racing, but saw nothing. No one had moved. No one had spoken. His mind told him to turn back, to stop looking, but his body wasn't obeying. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, like the weight of it was pressing down, on him, suffocating him. He staggered forward, his body tense with fear. His eyes darted to the exit doors. They were so close, but they seemed to stretch farther away with every step he took. And then, for a moment, just as his foot fell heavily on the floor, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. The whole terminal was plunged into darkness. The hum of the airport's machines stopped. The familiar sounds of footsteps and chatter disappeared. Daniel's breathing was all he could hear, shallow and fast. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out everything else. The whispers grew louder, louder than before. They surrounded him, creeping up from the floor, the walls, and even the ceiling. You can't leave. Stay with us. Stay in the dark. For a moment, Daniel thought he might lose his mind. The cold feeling of panic washed over him in waves, threatening to drown him. He needed to get out. He couldn't stay here. The door. The exit. He had to get to it. The lights came back on, flashing harshly in his eyes. But when his vision cleared, the people who had once sat still and lifeless in the terminal were no longer there. The seats were empty. Everything was still. The whispers faded, and for a moment, Daniel wondered if it had all been a dream. But when he turned to look toward the exit doors, his heart skipped. They were locked, and the silence once again felt too heavy. The locked doors loomed before him, unyielding and cold. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out every other sound. His hands trembled as he reached for the handle, twisting it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The sense of isolation hit him again, harder this time, sinking into his bones like a deep, unshakable dread. He stepped back, his heart racing, and turned around, looking for another exit, a way out of this nightmare. The terminal stretched out, before him, empty, ghostly. The low hum of the lights was the only sound left, a constant reminder that he was alone in this strange, forgotten place. The seats, the walls, the counters, all were eerily still. He had thought the silence was oppressive before, but now it was suffocating, weighing on his chest, making every breath feel shallow, every movement sluggish. The whispers had stopped, but their presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. The flickering lights overhead did little to ease the growing unease. Each time they flickered, Daniel's heart skipped. Was something watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake? He couldn't tell. All he knew was that the strange emptiness in the terminal was beginning to feel less like a quiet space and more like a trap, a cage that was slowly closing in around him. In the distance, at the far end of the terminal, the small, dimly lit information desk stood. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it drew his attention. It looked out of place. It didn't belong in the lifeless emptiness around him. Was someone there? Or was it just another illusion, another part of this twisted airport that didn't make sense? He couldn't be sure, but he had to check. His feet carried him across the terminal, the echo of his shoes on the floor seeming to grow louder with every step. It was as though the walls were pressing in on him, narrowing his path, making the journey feel endless. The air had grown colder as well, and Daniel wrapped his arms around himself, hoping to ward off the creeping chill that seemed to seep into his bones. As he reached the information desk, his heart sank. No one was there, but something on the counter caught his eye. A small, folded piece of paper, as though someone had left it there deliberately, just for him to find. With shaking hands, he picked it up and unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the writing was scrawled hastily in black ink. It read, "You're not supposed to be here. Get out while you can. They're watching." His breath caught in his throat, his eyes scanning the words over and over. It was as though the note was mocking him, daring him to ignore its warning. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, a cold shiver running through him. Who had left this note? And why now? Before he could make sense of it, a sudden sound broke the silence. A soft tapping, coming from somewhere in the terminal. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was clear someone was walking toward him. The sound of footsteps echoed in the stillness, each step deliberate, slow, and heavy. Daniel's heart slammed against his chest. Who was it? Could it be someone who had been here the entire time, hidden from view? Or was it something else? Something far worse? He turned quickly, his breath catching in his throat as he scanned the empty terminal. But there was no one. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence. He looked back at the paper in his hand, the words staring up at him like a grim reminder of the situation he found himself in. They're watching. Daniel clenched his fists around the note, a surge of panic rising in his chest. Something was terribly wrong. But what? Who was watching him? And what did they want? Before he could process any more of his thoughts, the lights flickered once more, this time with an unsettling flicker that lasted longer than before. The whole terminal seemed to shudder, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The lights flickered again, and when they returned, the atmosphere had changed. Everything had shifted. The once empty terminal now felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Shadows that had seemed harmless moments ago now stretched unnaturally across the walls, their forms twisting like they were alive, reaching toward him. The air was thick, suffocating, and Daniel's chest tightened with every breath. The whispers returned, but this time, they weren't distant. They were close, very close. He could hear them clearly now, each word distinct, and it sent chills down his spine. "You can't leave. You're ours now." The words slithered through the air, wrapping themselves around his mind, squeezing it tighter with each passing second. His vision blurred, and for a moment he couldn't tell where the voices were coming from. Were they from the walls? From the ceiling? Or were they inside his head, pulling him deeper into whatever nightmare this was? Daniel stumbled back, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here. But as he turned toward the exit doors, something stopped him in his tracks. There, standing at the end of the terminal, was a figure. It was tall, its features indistinct, but there was no mistaking its presence. It was watching him, its gaze fixed on him with an intensity that sent a jolt of terror straight to his heart. It didn't move, just stood there, as though it were waiting for him to make a move. His breath quickened, his mind racing. Should he run? Should he confront whatever this was? Suddenly, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, its shadow stretching longer and longer as it came closer. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. "Stay with us. Stay in the dark." Daniel's legs refused to cooperate. His body froze, caught in the grip of fear. The figure's face came into view, though it was still obscured by darkness. The shadow loomed larger and larger, and just as it reached out toward him, the terminal door behind him slammed shut with a deafening sound. The darkness took over. Daniel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. The lights went out, plunging him into complete blackness, and the last thing he heard before everything went still was the cold, whispering voice. "You're ours now." The darkness was absolute, suffocating, wrapping itself around Daniel's body like an invisible blanket. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat echoing in the silence that pressed in from every direction. He couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except his own labored breath. Panic surged through him. His hands reached out into the void, searching for something, anything, to anchor himself, but the air felt thick, unnatural. It was as if the very atmosphere had turned hostile, resisting him at every turn. For what felt like an eternity, he stood frozen, unable to move, unable to even breathe, without the overwhelming fear choking him. He was utterly alone, or at least he thought he was. But then he heard it. The whispers, faint at first, growing steadily louder until they became a constant hissing murmur. Words danced at the edge of his consciousness, just beyond his reach, like a language that couldn't quite be understood. The whispers were there, all around him, taunting him with their maddening cadence. Then, a figure materialized in the distance, though it appeared more as a silhouette against the blackness. Daniel's breath hitched. It moved slowly toward him, each step deliberate and heavy, as if the ground itself trembled with each motion. He could hear the soft shuffle of its feet on the floor, but it made no sound beyond that, no breathing, no rustling of clothes, nothing that might make it seem human. Yet it was close now, so close that Daniel could feel the presence looming over him like a heavy weight. A chill swept through him, colder than anything he had ever felt, colder than the air had ever been. His skin prickled with dread as he backed away, but the space he had once thought was an open terminal now felt like a maze, closing in on him from every side. The figure continued to advance, its shape becoming clearer, but its face remained obscured by the darkness, hidden from his eyes. Daniel could feel his sanity unraveling, the whispers building into a chaotic cacophony, their volume rising with each passing second. "Stay with us. Stay in the dark." The words came faster now, more urgent, desperate, and Daniel's chest tightened as he realized they were not just words, they were commands. The darkness seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart, and the air was thick with an unseen force, pushing him toward that figure that was closing in on him. He turned, trying to run, but his legs refused to move. It was as if they were rooted to the spot, pinned down by an unseen weight. The terror surged within him like a tidal wave, crashing over him, leaving him breathless. "Stay with us." The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, an undeniable force that shook him to his core. There was no way out, no way to escape. As the figure loomed closer, its outline becoming clearer, Daniel's mind raced. What was this thing? Who were these voices? What had happened to the airport? To the world he had once known? Every part of him screamed to break free, to fight, but he was paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch as the figure reached out toward him. Its hand was pale, its fingers long and unnaturally thin, like skeletal branches reaching from the shadows. It came closer and closer, until he could feel its cold, clammy fingers brushing against his skin. A surge of energy shot through him as the hand made contact, and for a split second, the darkness around him seemed to dissolve, just enough for him to see the figure's face. His stomach twisted into knots as he locked eyes with it, eyes that were not human, but something far worse. They glowed faintly, an unnatural green, a sickly light that seemed to pierce through the blackness, boring into him, into his very soul. The face was stretched and twisted, like something that had once been human, but had been distorted beyond recognition. The skin was pale and pulled tight over the bones, and there was an unsettling, vacant emptiness in its gaze. It was smiling, or perhaps it was grinning, but it was a smile that had no warmth, no kindness. Just a predatory, cold leer. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat as the figure leaned closer, its voice now a deep, reverberating hiss. "You cannot escape," it said, the words slithering into his ears. "You belong to us now, forever." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was trapped in this nightmare, in this place where nothing made sense, where time and reality had been twisted into something far darker than he could have ever imagined. He had come here, hoping to catch a flight, to return to the normal world, but now he was nothing more than a pawn in a game he didn't understand. The darkness began to close in around him again, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. The terminal had vanished entirely, leaving only the endless blackness. There was no escape. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. He was lost, and the darkness was all that remained. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the figure released its grip on him. The pressure in his chest lessened, and he stumbled backward, gasping for air. He looked around desperately, trying to find anything familiar, any sign that he was not completely lost, but the blackness was endless, stretching out in all directions. The whispers had stopped, but the suffocating silence felt even worse. It was as if the entire world had fallen silent, waiting for something. He couldn't stand it anymore. His legs moved on their own, carrying him forward, though he didn't know where he was going. The shadows pressed in closer, twisting and warping around him like living things, crawling and shifting. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing his path, leaving him with no choice but to continue forward, deeper into the nightmare. As he walked, the whispers returned, not from any specific direction, but from everywhere, as though the very walls themselves were alive. The voice he had heard before was back, the same voice, now louder, more insistent. "Stay with us. You are ours now." His mind screamed, but his body could not obey. He was caught in the web of darkness, entangled in a nightmare with no end. no escape. And then, as he walked, he felt the floor beneath him shift. The ground was no longer solid, but something softer, more yielding, as if he were walking on something that was not quite real. He tried to look down, but it was impossible. The darkness had swallowed him whole, and he was nothing more than a lost soul wandering in a place where nothing made sense. And as he continued walking, the whispers grew louder again until they were no longer just voices. They were laughter, cold, hollow and mocking. Stay with us. Forever. The final step had been taken, and there would be no returning from this darkness.